Okay, we're on. All right. So let me do sound check if there's anybody watching. Okay. Don't know if there is anybody watching. It says doesn't have any viewers showing up yet, but they should start filtering in. All right, now we have them, and they have confirmed they can hear. Okay, so since I last talked to you, I have presented to the Holodomor conference, which was out of Kiev, on German minority, and that went pretty well. And this morning, I got an email from London. It looks like I have a publisher for my book, The Years of Great Silence. So
wonderful. Who's the publisher?
It's a publisher in Germany, so it has a Latin name which I can't pronounce. It's something Verlag, obviously.
Verlag.
Let me see. I'll put it. Let me look it up.
That's exciting news. That's very exciting.
No. The Verlag just means publisher. I mean, but okay, yeah. Here it is. Ibidim Verlag. It's out of Stuttgart.
Did you do anything? I cannot see anything.
No, I haven't. I'll put the link to the publisher.
Well, sorry, what did you say it was called?
It says Ibidem Verlag out of Stuttgart.
Ibidem.
Yeah, I'll write it in the chat. So it's not finalized yet, but I sent them a synopsis and table of contents, and they got back to me, said they wanted to look at the whole manuscript.
That's fantastic news. Also, that it's a German publisher. It's brilliant news, especially for people like me who are Germans from Russia.
Well, I think it will be published in English.
Well, in whatever language it's published, it's still really good news for us, because it's if there will be exposure of about that type of history in Germany, in English language, whatever, it's perfect. I guess I just wanted to say, because I thought today before joining here, I thought about how
you're roboting.
Sorry?
Your sound is bad.
Oh, is it?
Go ahead.
No, well, okay. But I was thinking about how I'm doing this talk with you, and you're in the United States, and that I sometimes get the impression that people in the United States know more about this history than people in Germany. So this seems to be, I'm not gonna, but sometimes I think there's not enough interest in Germany for that history. So any kind of exposure is good, and any kind of introduction of people to this history is important. So German Verlag, very good, sehr gut.
So that's the good news I have. And the 14th is the anniversary of GKO Order 1281, which I put in the discussion in the chat. English translation from the Russian, but which I did. But it's the second mobilization order, or the second large one for the Labor Army. So this is mobilization of men that were already living in Siberia and Kazakhstan that were not deported.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about 40,000 people were mobilized into labor camps from that decree, and it's really overshadowed because World War II is such a big event, and there's so many things happening. But the day of the 14th is kind of overshadowed by the firebombing of Dresden. So It doesn't get as much attention, being such a smaller event, I guess, in terms
Mm.
of people involved.
Mm. Plus, I guess there were so many different orders within this time that it's difficult almost to focus on which one is important one, because of course we know 42, a bit later in October, comes a new order about inclusion of women into the labor army,
Yes.
which had a very devastating effect on the German families, of course, because then women and children had to be separated, and the destiny or fate of those children was terrible in many cases. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's basically the three big mobilizations in 42. So the 10th of January, 14th of February, and then 7th of October. But this one is close to the 14th of February, which, as I said, for people interested in World War II history, particularly the fate of German civilians, right? It gets overshadowed by what happens in 1945 with the bombing of Dresden in Saxony. But I've set this day aside so it won't get overshadowed by the larger bombing 3 years later.
I cannot see anyone, and I cannot see the chat either.
All right. Well, the chat is coming through on both StreamYards and YouTube for me. It should be on the right.
Yeah, it says private chat and it's empty.
All right. Here's what you do. Where it says private chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Go. There should be a where it says comments above.
Oh, now I can see it. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. So you can see the I don't know where Val Jean is from. Zedez is from Quebec.
Okay.
Equilux is local from Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Steve, I believe, is somewhere in the U.S., but further east from here. I can't remember where Pepe is, and I don't. So, but yes, I recognize most of these names, but not all of them. So, the you can see in the okay. So Valjean is in Houston. So most of the people coming in here from the U.S., but at least one person from Quebec.
Well, hi from London. Evening. 8 o'clock.
Yeah. So I suppose we should just start at the beginning in 41. Usually the story starts in August. The 26th of August is the decree by the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of People's Commissariats, and then 2 days later is the public decree by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. But earlier, forced evacuation out of Crimea into Ordzhonikidze, Krai, and Rostov Oblast. And even earlier, there are deportations from Belarusia, which aren't well documented. But you could come across them. I came across a woman in, I believe it was Kant in Kyrgyzstan, who had family who were deported from Belarus to Uzbekistan. And there weren't a lot of deportations to Uzbekistan. There are some from Moscow, and that have been, we have the archival records for still. But obviously, the vast majority are going to Western Siberia and Northern Kazakhstan.
So yes, I met someone here in Wales whose grandmother was deported from Belarus to, interestingly enough, to Aktube as well, to Aktubinsk, where I'm from, where my grandparents were deported as well. And in fact, we even found out because he had still a postcard that was sent out from Aktube. And the return address, when we looked it up with my parents, it was literally, she lived about 20 minutes walk from where we lived in Aktubinsk, but we were separated by about 30 or 40 years because she lived there 1940 something and she passed away, I think, 43. And we lived there in the 70s, 80s. But very close to where she was. So yeah, so she was deported from Belarus, but she was on the border with Poland to Aktubinsk, northern Kazakhstan, West Kazakhstan.
Yeah, we don't have a lot on the. There is some, but not a lot on the 8,000 or so Germans deported from Belarus. So that's just one of the kind of still murky spots that we have, but we do know that there some were. So it's not a complete blank, fortunately.
Yes, I speak both German and Russian.
And though after the deportations, they're put under special settlement restrictions, which with the same legal status as kulaks had received in 1930 and 1931. So I came across this term called racial kulaks, which I think almost fits because the status is assigned on the basis of nationalnost, first to Germans and then later to other peoples, Kalmuks, Karachais, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and especially when you get to the 26th of November 1948 decree making it permanent. That seems to be, racial kulak seemed to be a good, I think, description if you kind of translate nationalnost as a racialized ethnicity. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, from me, yeah, racial. Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I'm listening to you because I'm listening to you as a source of information as well. But yeah, I guess kulaks were used against many different nationalities. Germans were among them.
Right, but the legal status of spetspasalency or spetsperasalency, right, is basically the same category. It's people that are they're not full citizens because they can't choose their place of residency and they're under for the kulaks are the OGPU administration, but that later becomes the NKVD after 34. So the Germans and other deported peoples become the same. They have the same legal status, being wards of the NKVD and not being able to leave from their assigned place of residence after being deported. So if you look, you get the table. It says, contingent spetspasalency in all these documents, and it'll say former kulaks, and then it'll say Germans, and then it'll say northern Caucasus from the Crimea, etc., Kalmuks, etc. It's the same restrictions as far as their legal status.
Yes, but I wonder how with Germans. I guess also with other ones as well. But with Germans, we do have. So I know in my family, with my family history, is that first they were accused of being kulaks and sent to gulags. Then when they came back, they were accused to about 38, then started to be being accused of being German, like anti-German processes, and I think there were anti-Polish ones as well. So there was the Great Terror by Stalin. So they were accused of being German, and then of course 1941 when they were
The German operation starts in 37 and goes through 38.
exactly
And it's one of a number of national operations, but basically about 29,000 Germans are shot during that. But there's also a Kulak operation, which also hits a lot of ethnic Germans. The total number shot is almost 50,000. About my calculated, I got 46,000 death sentences to people of German nationality, but we don't have perfect figures on any of this stuff. This is one of the things that came up at the Holodomor conference out of Kiev, is that trying to get exact numbers on this is very difficult.
Yes. But I guess to me it sounds like the Germans, but also we cannot forget all the other ethnicities as well. But Germans, ethnic Germans, I mean, it seems that there was no escape really. So you have first your Kulak, then there's the Great Terror time, then there's the deportation. There's really no escape, and that kind of lasted for such a long time. Yeah.
There was some on the margins. So we see in 2nd of April 1938 there's a decree by the NKVD that makes it legally impossible to change your Nationalnost on your documentation.
That's true.
They were having people try and class themselves off as Russians or Ukrainians or anything but German, so they wouldn't be rounded up and shot.
Yeah.
And while it was illegal in 41, we know there are cases. The most famous is Richter, who took an Azerbaijani identity to avoid being sent out of the Red Army into the Labor Army and to continue fighting on the front. We have a handful of people we know with collaboration, usually of their higher up officers, that escape discharge from the Red Army and mobilization into the Labor Army. But yeah, it required a forgery of documents and lying whatnot about ancestry.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of many Russian Germans did feel, especially older generation, that they did all believe that it would have been better for them to fight in the war, in the Second World War, on the Soviet side of course, than being in the Labor Army. Labor Army is something that they felt was more used as a punishment, and being in the war, they would have been able to show that they believed in the country, but that chance, that the opportunity was taken from them.
Well, there is about 30,000, mostly Volga Germans, that did fight between June and August in the Red Army.
Short time, and then they would demobilized and then sent to Labor Army. So that was a period, yeah.
That the last of them were sent out in 7th of September was the decree. But there was a big battle at Brest, which had a disproportionately very large number of Volga Germans fighting against the Nazis in the Red Army ranks. And so you have kind of one heroic Alamo of Volga Germans fighting on the Soviet side early in the war.
Yeah. I wonder what it would have been like if those people had the chance to fight in the war, but I think the majority of people did see Labor Army. And even speaking to my grandma, who has been to Labor Army and then later to Gulag, and who then used to say, or who told me that Labor Army was far worse than Gulag was, and so that just to me, it's just kind of gave me an idea of what the conditions were like in Gulag, in Labor Army. And I think she explained to me as well, is because Labor Army, they were pretty much starving when she received 20 years of Gulag, and and you would think, oh my goodness, that's really terrible. But she said Gulag was so much easier because they got warmer clothing. She was sent to Vorkuta, so it's kind of north of Arctic Circle, about 150 kilometers north of Arctic Circle, and yet she perceived it as being easier because she said, A, we got warm clothing, B, we got food at least twice a day, and even if it was very small amount, they still got some food. And C, the children were taken away from this woman and sent to orphanages, but she said it was still, even though she spent quite a lot of time searching for her son, because one of the things they did in the orphanage with German children is they changed their names. And I think it was just part of this thing of making it more difficult for the enemies of the state to find their children. Speak my grandma. But she said at least she knew that her son, even though she couldn't find him, but she knew he was in an orphanage and he would get some food. Whereas when they were in the Labor Army, there was a complete lack of supply of food. There was no food. Sometimes she would be taken for weeks away from her son, and her son was just a small child who the children were just left alone. There were no adults to supervise them. There were just old people who couldn't get up or couldn't do anything, and it was the children. And the children, pretty much, a lot of them starved. There was nobody to look after them. They died of illnesses and starvation. And so I think that knowing that you are taken away from your child, starving yourself, but also not knowing if your child will have any food at all because there was nobody to feed them. It's pretty much children were looking after the children.
Right. This is one of the things that comes up about the mobilization of women, and this is there are some other smaller groups that are partially mobilized into the Labor Army, but only in the case of Germans do they mobilize women.
That's
So
correct.
there are some Finns and some Koreans and even some Russian kulaks, but except for the Germans, they're all men, and there's a huge number of women that are mobilized after October 1942, and in many cases, their husbands are dead or had already been mobilized into the Labor Army. So we have this de facto orphaning of huge numbers of children in Kazakhstan and Siberia.
Mm. I mean, I read terrific horrible stories, and speaking also to relatives as well as of German children who were left behind, and at some stage the state decided that they had to be adopted, so they forced adopt them. So they forced Russian families to adopt those German evil children, and that, of course, for the children, didn't really go well. Being in a family that was forced by the state to adopt you, and most of the time a family that probably lost a family member to the Nazi army, then had to host or adopt a German child. So that had terrible consequences for everyone. But those that were adopted were the lucky ones. There were many that just
Yes. Have you seen? Let me put it in the chat. It's Reklama from Kazakhstan on the German deportation. It's very short, and mobilization of the Labor Army. It makes the Kazakhs look like good guys and the Russians all bad guys.
Yeah, I've seen it. Please put it in again. I would like to see it again.
I think it's very good. But I think, of course, obviously, there were Kazakhs that were very helpful, and there were some that were not. There were Kazakhs, of course, in the NKVD, and
Yeah, of course.
um, if you read the memoirs by Berta Bachmann, the wife
Yeah,
of Eugen Bachmann, she talks about there were some rather brutal NKVD and other ethnic Kazakh officials for the special settlers, the ethnic Germans. But
yeah.
so obviously the Kazakh government today has an interest in portraying that they were the good guys, and all the bad stuff was the Russians or other European nationalities. But I still think it's a good little, I think, short piece that kind of encapsulates a lot of what happened, though.
Yeah, I think for me personally, in our family history, there's a wonderful story about Kazakh people, and I mean, I guess I can consider myself Kazakh if I grew up in Kazakhstan, even though genetically I'm not. But we have wonderful. I think my grandma had a great story, and that was. When she actually received great help from when they first arrived, when they were first dropped off in the snow after they were deported. And the story goes that so after they were deported, 1941, they were just dropped off in the snow, women and children, no man, and the train just left, and they arrived. I think it was probably December and around maybe end of November and December. But Kazakhstan, especially Aktobe, in that time can be incredibly cold. So you can have minus 30 degrees.
Even south of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, which is supposed to be the warm part of Central Asia, is freezing cold.
Yeah.
In the winter.
Yeah, I mean, Kazakhstan has. I was just looking up temperatures, and so when I was growing up, it was just every winter you would have terrible snowstorms, but you would have minus 40 is quite a normal temperature, minus 40 Celsius. I'm not sure what it's in Fahrenheit, but it's quite normal. I think the record cold temperature in Aktobe was minus 46. But anyway, so after they were dropped off and there was absolutely no protection, and I don't know if you know, but Kazakhstan, that part of Kazakhstan is very flat. There's no protection, there's no tree, it's steppe, and so there's nothing, nowhere to hide. So the first thing that they did is building igloos, pretty much just cutting up. And that's, I'm saying that's women and small children, yeah, and old people on the whole train. And so cutting out, and the train basically left. But so they're cutting out blocks of ice to make igloos, and they realize that only if by kind of sitting together and having protection from the elements, they will be able to survive. But then come morning, by morning, many people froze. And one of the things that my grandma did and her sister, they left my mother and my uncle behind. They were just babies, just 8 months old. And they walked along the train tracks to the next settlement. And they walked in snow and wind and how long they walked. But they came across a aul. Aul, like a Kazakh.
Yeah, Kazakh village.
Kazakh village, right? And made out of yurts, just a few yurts, and that was, so for my grandma said that's pretty much what saved their lives. So they came across the yurt, and they were in Kazakh tradition, you're invited in and you're supposed to share with your guest whatever you have, even if you don't have much. And she said all they gave us was just warm cup of tea, maybe, or even water, just something warm, warmed us up. And what they did, they notified the authorities, and so the authorities sent sleds and horses to pick up the people. But that was arriving in a new country, in a new place, not being able to speak the language, not being able to speak Kazakh, or just probably broken Russian. And those Kazakh people, I don't even know if they spoke any Russian back then.
Some did, but obviously in the rural areas,
Yeah, so
our
in our all,
smaller
yeah,
number did.
exactly. I doubt that they spoke any Russian in Aul, in a small village, but who knows? But anyway, they managed to. I mean, I guess in times of they, they were able to somehow they were able to
I
communicate.
suspect they would have some small amount of Russian language knowledge by early 40s, but they certainly wouldn't be fluent like they later became. So, I mean, today, obviously, in particularly places like Almaty, right, everybody speaks fluent Russian, even if they are ethnically Kazakh and their first
Yeah,
language they learned was Kazakh.
yeah,
But in the rural areas, obviously, it took longer, and so yeah, my understanding they would have just known very basic Russian probably by that time, and
but
it would have been not evenly distributed. So Kazakh men that had served in the military would know more Russian
yeah.
than the rest of the population.
But we also need to think that the Germans that arrived there, they didn't speak barely any Russian themselves, women and
This
children.
is correct. They would have had the same kind of distribution that unless you were urban minority in Angles or
Exactly.
dealing with the Soviet government or, and
But if
outside of the republic, or if you were somebody who had served in the military and learned Russian that way. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, it's after the deportations in the really 1950s and 60s, you see Russian becoming a lingua franca. So you have people with native languages German speaking to people with native languages Kazakh in Russian.
yes. Yeah, somehow they managed to find, of course, a common. Well, I don't know. Sometimes you don't need to use words to explain what you need. But you are absolutely right. When I was growing up, in regards to the language, because that I find that's interesting as well. So when I was growing up in Kazakhstan, my Kazakh friends, they didn't speak any Kazakh anymore, and at all. And I
Well,
remember
that's unusual.
no,
Uh,
not at all. A majority of people in cities in Kazakhstan didn't speak.
really?
Yeah, didn't. That was one of the major issues. Majority of
Because in Kyrgyzstan, uh, there is an urban population that doesn't speak Kyrgyz that are ethnically Kyrgyz, but
mm,
there's been so much migration uh, starting in really the 1970s from the countryside, right? That you had kind of a majority always that was bilingual. So people would come basically from rural areas into the cities and then become bilingual because they had Kyrgyz already and then learned Russian.
well, I can. I think I read once some statistics about the loss of language in Kazakhstan, and
By
so
Kazakhs.
by Kazakhs. Yeah, so
Okay.
definitely in the 80s and 90s, the amount of
Yeah.
Kazakh
Yeah.
spoke.
When I taught in Kyrgyzstan, there were some urban uh, Kyrgyz that didn't speak Russian. They tended to be people who had been part of the elite beforehand and were now ultra nationalist, even though they were the people who had the worst command of Kyrgyz.
Hmm.
Uh, but I'm outside of Bishkek, uh, Kyrgyz is still the first language. So people would have Kyrgyz then Russian.
Mm.
So like my wife, she grew up in Talas
Hmm.
Oblast, and she basically uh, went to school. It was Kyrgyz and Russian language, and this was during the late 70s and early 80s uh, for schooling.
Yeah. Well, I get it might have been very different in different places, but I can definitely with certainty, and I think there's difference between Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, especially bigger cities in Kazakhstan, where a lot of people didn't speak any Kazakh at all. Uh, but saying that after the independence, so I remember it was probably about 88 and 89. That's when, because I learned Kazakh, you're supposed to have, you learn Kazakh at school as well as part of the curriculum. But and I know that people didn't know Kazakh because they were my friends, and I knew that their level of Kazakh was as good as my level of Kazakh. But 89 and 88, probably 87, 88, 89, it started changing. So there was more kind of calls to introduce more Kazakh, also have Kazakh on TV and translate some movies or some multiki, some trick films into Kazakh. So I think the changes started happening, and then because we left, I think after, and one of the things that started happening is as well is that at some stage they said in Kazakhstan, in order to get higher education, to go to university, you would need to do a Kazakh exam, and that was very sudden, and it was kind of a clear sign that Kazakhstan starting to develop or discover back its language and the roots and tradition, and fair enough, asking for people to pass Kazakh before you can study. But then, of course, that meant that those people like the Russians, the Ukrainians, and whoever else, the Germans who lived in Kazakhstan, could not pass the exam and could not go to university and study unless you somehow learned Kazakh fluently very quickly. So but that's just part of the Soviet Union and how it used to be. But the whole thing I just wanted to say is why I brought it up is because I remember, like, my friend Dina, and we would go and have dinner at her place, and we would have traditional bishbarmak or whatever we were eating, and her grandma was there, and her grandma used to live with them, and I remember her grandma used to speak Kazakh, and I would be like saying to Dina, "Oh, what did your grandma say, or what did she say? I didn't understand anything. Grandma didn't speak any Russian," and Dina used to say, "I don't know it myself. I don't really speak to my grandma. I don't understand her. She only speaks Kazakh." And I remember listening to her, and back then thinking, wow, it's kind of sad, because there was a similar situation, I guess, with us and my grandma, who spoke German all the time at home. But the reason that she only spoke it at home was because it was really forbidden to speak it anywhere outside of home. And yet my grandma really tried to pass on the language. But in Aygula and Dina's case, it's almost like Kazakh was not cool enough, and the young generation didn't want to speak it anymore. I don't
Well,
think it was 1980.
I mean, maybe yeah, that sounds. I guess because it's less rural, it was more industrialized. I guess Kazakhstan became more Russified linguistically than Kyrgyzstan.
It's very much possible, yeah. Yeah.
But certainly, I had to make sure that I knew that my wife prefers to speak Kyrgyz.
Yeah.
That my daughter would learn Kyrgyz, but I had to make sure that she'd learn a language that was spoken by more than 3 million people. So I told my wife that the daughter had to learn Russian as well. That she's gonna have to get Russian from an early age on. So
Okay.
particularly since I don't speak Kyrgyz. I mean, I know just a few phrases and words and whatnot. So my entire communication with my family is in Russian since I not smart enough at well, I'm now 50 to learn Kyrgyz well enough to be usable.
Oh, I think if I got the opportunity now, I would learn. I would love to learn Kazakh again or remember more. Yeah, but as a child, I didn't really. As a child, I think you're given opportunities that you don't always take.
Yeah, but the thing is, in Central Asia, at least since I don't know the 60s or so, since everybody already speaks Russian, it's just so much easier to go and speak Russian, right? Because
Yeah.
by the time you can figure out how to say something in one of the indigenous languages, right, the person you're talking to is going to have lost patience with you.
No, and but I do find it fascinating how the language is promoted, right? So what the state decides, what is important, and I think it was done in a very kind of clear cut way. For example, all the movies. So it doesn't matter where you live in Ukraine or Latvia or Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. Majority of the TV programs, really cool things, were done whatever cool could be, because most of the time we just watched war movies, but where Germans were always bad and Nazis and so on.
The Soviets had some great Multfilming, the cartoons in the 70s and 60s.
Yeah, I love the cartoons. Yeah,
Yeah,
but they were, for example, they were all in Russian. So
right.
so for example, I mean, in Kazakh became as this language that for young people as well, especially like me and my friends, Kazakh friends, it was just not a cool thing to do, because education was in Russian. If you wanted to progress, you needed to speak proper Russian. All the TV, multiki, everything else is in Russian. So Kazakh was seen as something that would hold you back. And German, of course, was seen as something that you shouldn't be doing anyway. So not really. I mean, you were not allowed to speak German even in the breaks at school. It's just was not accepted, because it's
Right.
the language of Nazis. So yeah, the victors write the history, and that's very much true. And I think the Germans from Russia know it really well themselves. Because I think like the German history in Russia was kind of eliminated and erased.
Yeah, but perhaps we put things in a longer perspective. Perhaps the conflict is not over yet,
Okay.
right? So World War II, the repression. This we can look at as an episode, perhaps the worst episode, I would say, in the history of the group, but not the final episode, not the conclusion. So I like to think not in terms of victim narratives. I know a lot of Reichsdeutsche talk
Yeah.
about Volksdeutsche from East and Central Europe and the Soviet Union, focusing on victim narratives and trying to portray Germans as from the East as victims, and kind of have a cherry picked history. But I think he's missing people like thinking Hans Christian Petersen is one of these guys that
Yeah.
criticizes the Russian German historians for that. He's missing the point that the reason that's focused on is it has to be overcome to get to the point where we want to be, which is the redemption. That is to overcome the damage, the suffering, the horror of the Stalin era, and to have a redemption. It's not about being a victim. It's about redeeming yourself from or the group as from victimhood, to reincorporate it into a normalized history rather than a history of suffering and oppression. Right. So that's part of it. You have to tell it to overcome it, but that's not where like you want to focus on forever. Obviously.
Well, I think In a way, I agree with Hans Christian Petersen in a way as well, because the Russian-German history became kind of the history of suffering. And it seems that when we think I mean as Russian Germans in Germany, if we think about our history as a collective history, a lot of times what unites all of us is the suffering and the pain. And this is something that I believe also we kind of need to move on from. But in order to move from that understanding what is our identity and who we are and what is our history, I think one of the first steps that need to be done is we need to be able to talk about it, and also we need to be listened to. And this is, I think, maybe what you said as well, the times of silence. This silence is still there. This silence, the fact that Russian Germans still do not like to talk about this past. And I understand for the people who survived that, lived through that, it's quite a traumatic past. And you do not really want to talk about trauma. And then what happens then the next generation comes, and the next generation doesn't know anything about it. It's almost like a collective forgetting. One generation didn't want to talk about it. The next generation kind of happy to forget about it. But it's still history, and it's still there. And we need to really first to talk about it, and we also need to be listened to. And I think another issue is that in Germany, the normal German population in Germany doesn't really want to know much about it. And I'm constantly surprised. So when I speak to people, my friends in Germany, or I speak to my German friends here in London, I have to explain to them who I am, what kind of German I am. And I have to explain to them. So before I can say, yeah, I'm a German from Russia. And then I have to spend quite a bit of time to tell them about the history. And I'm always stunned that they do not know anything about the history of Germans who lived in Eastern Europe. This is what surprises me. And I think this is, so I'm absolutely fine if I speak to an American person, or I speak to an English person and tell them I'm a German from Russia, and they go, oh, we don't know anything about it. And I say, you know what, that's fine. I will tell you who we are, and this is our history. However, when I speak to Germans about the history, and they say, I don't know who Germans from Russia are, this is something that doesn't sound good to me. It's not right. So the first step is to talk about our history and our identity. And the second thing would be to be listened to. And I think only after we were listened to that we can really start talking about other parts of our identity, who we are, and build new and more positive storyline of our identity. But I've been to, I don't know. For me, it was fascinating when I went to North Dakota, and I went to to do this presentation about Russian Germans.
Was it North Dakota or South Dakota?
Rapid City. North
Dakota? Okay, yeah, that's
Rapid City. I think that's North Dakota, right?
I think it is too. Yeah. But it might be South Dakota. Let me look it up. North Dakota has a much larger population of Black Sea Germans from Ukraine and Crimea. It's South Dakota. Rapid City is South Dakota. Okay. But there are a large number as well in South Dakota. So Rapid City is in South Dakota. So there are even more Germans from Russia in North Dakota who go to places like Bismarck.
Mm. But one of the things that so when I went to South Dakota, to Rapid City, and did the presentation, and it was a Russian-German conference, and I think the difference for me is a German from Russia, from Germany, who lives in London, and anyway. But coming
is it AHSGR?
yeah, I went So no, I went to
Oh,
GRHS. So,
GRHS, Germans from Russia Heritage Society.
yeah,
Okay. There's also
and
AHSGR, which is
yeah. So
in
next year,
Lincoln, Nebraska.
yeah, I did presentation. There was also with Eric Schmaltz was there as
Yes, I know
well.
Schmaltz very well.
Yeah, so I met him in Berlin, and he was the one who mentioned it and eventually invited me to come. So, anyway, what I wanted to say is, when I went to Rapid City, did my presentation about the history of Germans from Russia. One of the things that, for me, that really struck me was how those Germans from Russia that I met in America, um, how they saw their identity, and they saw it in a much more positive light. And um, it anyway, and those people that are in Germany, that left in Germany, when you speak to them and speak to them about their identity, is much more negative, and it's something that they're ashamed of, and something that I don't want to talk about, something that I want to move on from. And anyway, so I would like to change. I think we need to change that. We need to change that. There are fantastic stories about Germans from Russia. We need to understand the history and be proud of who we are. Sorry, I don't know. I got sidetracked because we wanted to talk about 1941
No,
until
no, that's fine. I
1955.
think it's important because obviously the reason we deal with this is, as you said, it hasn't been well known, even among Germans that are not uh, descendant of Aussiedler and Spate Aussiedler, and it still hasn't, as it were, been fully overcome to reach the redemption. But obviously, the redemption, the getting back to this kind of positive narration of history from the negative is obviously kind of the long term goal. So it's fine to put the end point there, the goal point, where we're going. Hopefully,
I'm just looking up redemption in German, what it means. Erlösung? Okay. I'm just trying to understand what it means.
oh, sorry.
Erlösung in German. Okay. Ablösung. Okay. Who's the German speaker there? There's a guy from Vienna. It's redemption, Erlösung. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Let me see what it is in Russian.
Well, on the topic of acceptance and being German and identity, and you're looking up redemption.
Yeah. Iskuplenie.
Aha, Iskuplenia. Okay.
Oh. Yeah, but it also kind of has the same type of connotations as other words that in English have re. So
redemption.
the organization, for instance, created in the Soviet Union was Wiedergeburt, rebirth. You kind of have the same type of idea there. Something coming of new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I read. I think there was a quote that I thought was.
Wiener Kranich says he didn't think that the redemption had the real good translation in German, so he has it in German here. The
Yeah.
Redemption habe ich nie verstanden. Da es
Yeah.
keine klare Übersetzung gibt, ich suche heute noch. So
Yeah. Maybe that's.
redemption is definitely an English word. Right. So I'm not sure. I mean, if we perhaps we might think more closely the idea of rebirth, Wiedergeburt, because that
No,
was the term used in the 1990s.
no. You mean redemption, Wiedergeburt? Nein,
No,
that.
Wiedergeburt is rebirth, but I mean it's
Oh yeah.
they have a similar type of connotation. I mean, redemption may be a word that doesn't really work in German.
Well, the only one that I have is Erlösung, but I guess maybe it has a slightly different meaning in English than it has in German.
Well, I'm
Erlösung.
just going by this statement here by Wiener.
Mm-hmm. It's a hanging chair, guys. Like
A medieval torture device.
Mhm. Is there anything that you would like to discuss? Because I can go on about identity.
Well, you sent me an email the other week about the forced repatriation to by the U.S. and British forces back to the Soviet Union. So
Yeah,
that is something that was well known in the U.S. when I was growing up in the 80s, although not specifically for ethnic German. It's kind of been forgotten. But Sloane Coffin, who was a famous preacher in New York, an anti-war activist during Vietnam, was one of the U.S. soldiers that witnessed a mass suicide by ethnic Russians that were going to be forcibly returned to the Soviet Union at Fort Dix in New Jersey. And so that was early on in the 1940s, that kind of in the consciousness that three Russian soldiers had found ways to kill themselves using either the glass from broken windows or their shoelaces rather than go back to the USSR.
Yeah. So yes, both of mine. So I did more research. So I tried to understand, of course, what it was like. So the people we have those Germans who ended up fleeing or moving back with the German forces back to Germany and looking for safety, of course. And I guess for me it was just, I guess, one of those very historic facts to realize that those people who were looking for protection, after all this time traveling, walking convoys to all the way to Germany, then arriving in Germany, and then realizing that they were not safe, and that the Soviet army was knocking on the doors, collecting those people and sending them back to Siberia and back to Soviet Union, and then either to Siberia or to Central Asia. And I think for me, but also another thing that I read is that they also said that the American soldiers worked together with the Russian army, and so they apparently had the lists as well, and they worked with the lists that the Russian army provided them with. So that meant that the Germans that even escaped to the kind of western zones in Germany still were not safe. And so I think for me to understand that feeling of, escaping and trying to get away and searching for safety, and then hoping that they found it, and then being betrayed again. And so I think you mentioned that about 250,000 were sent back to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, about 230,000.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's a very large number. Now, both of my grandfather and my great grandfather, one of them was um, in Austria. My great grandfather was in Austria, and my great father was in the West Prussia. But I don't really know, but I have the documents. That's what they usually. That's what they were after the war. Both of them were sent back to the Soviet Union, and both of them ended up in labor hours in Gulag. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I had my great grandfather had two cousins that were in Berlin that came west at the end of the war, and we have some letters from them in the old German dialect, and so one of them he put a 50,000 US dollar bond, which at the time was a huge amount of money, to sponsor over to the U.S. So the bond was there to make sure he didn't tap into any federal resources, I guess, welfare or whatnot. But the other guy got sent back to the Soviet Union, and we have no idea what happened to him. So
Yeah. I I think for me, because I lived through those stories, and all of those stories are very close to me and affect me as well. So um, I don't know. I think many things about, for me, all of those things, what makes us human, what um, you know, do we deserve to be saved? Is it okay to be betrayed? Is it okay to be sent to gulags over and over again? Is it okay to lose your family, or someone taking away from you your family for nothing else than just being of German ethnicity, or of being of any other ethnicity? I mean, those are the things that I find just difficult to understand, and history makes it just so difficult. And I went through stages where I hated Russians because they did all those things to my family. And then and then had endless conversations with my parents because they're pro Soviet Union, and I just could never understand it. Thinking, how can you be pro-Soviet Union? You, of all people, who were sent to orphanage, whose parents were sent to gulags, and who lost everything. Everything was taken away from you. You were never allowed to return back to your villages. You had to sign a document um, in order to leave the special settlement, saying you will never ask for any reimbursement for everything that you lost, and you will never return back to your place. And during the special settlements time, you didn't have any human rights whatsoever. I mean, this is all terrible time, and yet my parents are pro Soviet Union. And of course, so for a while I hated Russia because it stood for kind of everything that happened in the Soviet Union. I don't hate it anymore. And then I also didn't understand the Germans. I didn't like Germans as well, because Germans were it was there, in my opinion, well, at that back when I was a teenager. But Germans were responsible for what happened to us. If Germans wouldn't have invaded, we wouldn't have been deported. So I made them responsible for it as well. But I guess history is just a very dirty business, and war is a very awful thing. So those things happen, and I don't understand why people do those to people to each other. But one interesting thing is that I remember, just in regards to how little people in Russia know about the Germans that lived there. When we went to St. Petersburg a few years ago to a wedding, maybe I told you that before.
yes, about the sailors.
Yeah, and the guy, so we met those people who were really friendly, and then he said, "Oh, you speak really good Russian," and I told him, "Yeah, I'm." Even though you're German, he said, because he knew we were a German group, and then I said, "Well, I grew up in Kazakhstan," and he said to me, "Oh, so your parents and your grandparents were Nazis who came to Russia, and then you liked Russia so much that you stayed, or they liked Russia so much that you stayed." And I mean, comments like this, I really do not know what to say. I I don't think I said anything. I just said something like that. Yeah, but they ended up staying, and unfortunately, we didn't really have any other choice. But yeah, it just tells me how little people know about it.
Well, I will tell you, when I was teaching Soviet history in Kyrgyzstan, and we got to 1930 with the dekulakization, and I assigned some reading on people's being uprooted and deported to the far north and the Urals and everything being taken from them. And I had one student, she was very good, she was ethnic Russian, was a evangelical Protestant, not a member of the Pravoslav Orthodox Church, but very good student, spoke very good English, and I asked her about the piece, and she got very angry. And I said, "Why are you angry?" She said, "Because we were never told about this. We had no idea this had happened. They took everything from these people and destroyed their lives, and it's like a total blank in the post-Soviet world."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. The fact that the Soviet Union or Russia never apologized for it. I mean, the person from Vienna, I assume he's from Vienna, talks about Wiedergutmachung, and there's nothing like that, Wiedergutmachung in the Soviet Union or in Russia. The fact that the Russian German history is still not acknowledged, that what happened to those people is still not acknowledged, and the worst thing, even, that nobody knows anything about it and now it's forgotten. It's the history that never existed because nobody talks about it. Nobody ever apologized for it. And I think there's no healing that could ever take place until it was acknowledged by the officials, until someone said, "We are sorry that that has been done to you." And up until now, nothing like that has been done. I mean, all of
Yeah, there's like very token. I mean, there's a one resolution in 1989 and one in 1991, but they were never well publicized or well known among the population. So I mean, and I
not
think finally there was some material compensation for the few survivors of the labor army, but it was like 2,000 euros total.
I,
And there were very few left alive by the time the payment was made.
well, I'm not, I have not, I think I've heard that once, but everyone that I know, Russian, German, who went to a labor army, never received any compensation. I think there was a discussion that one in the forums was discussed as well, and they said that there's supposed to have been some kind of compensation, but everyone was just saying, never ever have my parents or grandparents received anything like that. And also, of course, the fact that they could never return back to their villages and to their homes, and everything that they owned was just taken away from them. And not just that, we're not talking about just the material possessions. Of course, we are talking about the language and culture and the religion, all of those things. You know, the fact that my elderly grandmother, still in the 1980s, had to hide in order to go to her Catholic sessions,
Maths.
mass, to go to church, which wasn't really a church, which was just a house, and they had every week had to do it in a different house because they were hiding. And I mean, all of this is, when we talk about freedom, this is is not freedom that I talk of. This is not freedom. The fact that they were not allowed to speak the language, the fact that, my grandmother, the language that she spoke, or the language that they spoke for 200 years when they arrived in Russia, was getting forgotten. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, I don't know how many people actually ever received the payment, but supposedly there was a few people that did. But obviously, again, we're talking very much a token response by the post-Soviet government of the Russian Federation with regard to this. I think their opinion, as well as most of the post-Soviet states in Central Asia, is to kind of, as I said, kind of let the issue remain a blank spot, and
I would like.
eventually, it will go away.
Well, in what way? Because people forget it. Is
No,
that
because there will be no everybody that experienced will be dead. Yeah, and if it's not remembered, it will disappear from the public collective memory.
But epigenetic trauma remains. I just think that even if, that's I don't know, is that not a tragic thing on its own? That eventually the history will be forgotten, but the trauma will remain. That can take place.
Yeah, but particularly in the southern part of Central Asia, the population has dwindled. Most of it has emigrated out to Germany. So and most of what is left are people that are elderly. The children have already left to Germany.
Yeah.
So I think we're talking less than 10,000 ethnic Germans in Kyrgyzstan now, whereas it was over 100,000 in 1989. Kazakhstan is different in that there's still about 200,000, especially around Akmola. There's, I guess it's now Nur Sultan. They've renamed it again, but
I know.
population.
Nur Sultan. I know. That's great to be able to rename the place so many times.
Oh yeah, it's been Akmola, Stalingrad, Nur Sultan.
Yeah.
But that was where they had a daily German language newspaper. It was basically
Stalingrad, yeah.
Freundschaft. It was basically just Pravda translated into German, but it was the only German language newspaper to come out every day. The Neues Leben out of Moscow didn't come out as frequently.
Mm-hmm. I would love to. I do have contact with people in with the Russ-Deutsch Society in Moscow. Well, just small contact, and I would like to go and. I would like to go back to Kazakhstan anyway and check it out.
The Russian German society obviously is small because the population has now become small, but in Kyrgyzstan, they're pretty friendly. They're over on Akambayeva, which is the street over by all the hospitals, the medical center of Bishkek.
Okay.
But they're pretty accessible, and they do have a monument in the front of their building to victims of the labor army. The Germans in Kyrgyzstan, they weren't deported there during the war, but the ones that were already living there, that had settled since 1882, were mobilized in the 14th of February 1942 decree, the local German so-called, and sent out to various other parts of the Soviet Union, as well as the two big dams that they still get electricity from. You can take a bus from downtown Bishkek to Alamedin and Voroshilov. Of course, Voroshilov, Minister of Defense under Stalin, so you haven't even changed the name. You can see these hydroelectric stations that were built by the forced labor of the Trudovaya Armia.
Mm. Can I ask you what are you know how you mentioned that, well, we know that Germans were the only ethnic group that where women were taken into labor army as well, with horrific consequences, because that meant separating women from the children. So if the child was older than 3 years old, the woman was separated from the child, and the child pretty much had to survive on its own. But given that it was just the German woman who it was done to, um, what do you think? Is it something that you believe or you think could be seen as Stalin punishment specifically because they were German?
Well, it was the only group that it happened to, because as I said, there are smaller mobilizations among other ethnic groups, but they're always all men. So the women were only mobilized among the ethnic Germans into the Trude Armia. So
Do you
there
think
are,
punishment out of punishment?
I, I think this is a big part of it. I mean, the whole of the Gulag labor, particularly during the Second World War, which was so inefficient compared to free labor, despite being so deadly. So I think I was reading somewhere that you know it was at least a free worker was at least 1.5 times more productive. Sometimes considerably more productive, maybe 3 or 4 times the people that were working in the camps. I think the labor army conscripts were slightly more productive than Gulag prisoners, but not a whole lot, maybe like 120%. So, it would have been more efficient to have them still be free wage laborers. Uh, and there are also, there's the term mobilization uh, basically had two meanings. There were the punished peoples, mostly Germans, uh, where they're sent to the labor camps and under very horrible conditions. But there were also people that were mobilized from the Central Asian and uh, Ural natives that were sent to factories, and they had considerably better conditions. I think Krieger talks about the differences between mobilized Uzbeks in factories and mobilized Germans in labor camps, that there were special rations of
Yeah.
rice and mutton and naan, as well as shorter working hours, particularly when it was cold outside.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember
So
Krieger had
yeah,
also a quote or somewhere that I read that said something. It was an order saying that the Germans are not, we're not allowed to be used, German women as well, we're not allowed to use for lighter work like administrative work or office work.
yes,
So
this is true.
women had to work in a kind of heavy. Um,
A lot of them ended up working in oil extraction, where the
yeah.
People's Commissariat of Oil.
Mm.
Uh,
So yeah, I just wanted to understand, was that kind of like an obvious punishment for what happened in the war, that he even decided to mobilize women? The only women that were mobilized were the German women.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
mm,
I would say so too. And also, when you look at the forced repatriation documents, to where they're sending people. For instance, I have some that deal with the Germans that were evacuated by the Wehrmacht from uh, the area around Leningrad into Estonia. And then when the Soviets reoccupied Estonia, they were decreed to, uh, to be Soviet citizens of a enemy nationality that needed to be sent to special settlement. But they sent them to special settlements in Yakutia and Komi,
Mm-hmm.
and to work felling trees. And the documents themselves talk about, these are women with large numbers of small children, and many of the men are invalids or incapable of working. So it doesn't seem like they're choosing these places as a way of economic efficiency, because these people just aren't going to be capable of doing that type of heavy labor. It's just a way to punish them, make them try and do the heavy labor, even though they're invalids, or uh, people otherwise not physically capable of this really hard physical labor in very hostile climates. I mean, if you look on the map of the Soviet Union, right, these are very far north, and if you look at
Yeah.
the temperatures and the wind chill, it's very deadly. You can die of hypothermia easily.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I guess it's just for me to understand, because nowhere did Stalin say or write in the documents that it was the use of Germans was as a use of punishment, but yet all the indications are there. The harsh conditions, the use of women, the separation of women and children, all of those things as indications are there. And yeah,
And also the lack of defined terms of how long the labor would be. Right? It was they would have served for the duration of the war, and then the war ended, and they still weren't released.
yeah. So that's something that I wanted to discuss with you as well, because they supposed to have been, so in 1945 when the war ended, and many of the special settlers and people that were in the labor army were celebrating first, thinking that they will be released, including my grandmothers. But I think it was 1945 that then another order came in saying, well, actually, you're not released, you're still in special settlements. And
Yeah, they weren't released from special settlements until the end of 1955.
yeah, that's
But
right.
it got there was a decree in November of '48 which said that they are to be special settlers in remote areas from which they were exiled for all eternity. Right, so it's the only Soviet document I've seen that uses the word "navechna."
Yeah. So 1948 was actually the harshest for the Russian-German history. I think this document, one of the harshest documents that people felt is because, yes, they were told, that was finally when they were told that the deportation is of Ewigkeit, yeah, eine wieczna, permanent, and they are never allowed to return back. And I think that was when they finally understood that there will never be a way back. That they and probably also understood that they will be keep on working in the same conditions until they
But,
die.
but they were told that. I mean, if you look at the uh, documents from submitted from special commandants in 1941 from various places in Kazakhstan. I think Paladunsk Rayon in North Kazakhstan Oblast is one where he says the Germans need to understand that they are exiled here forever, that this is their new home.
Mm. Yeah, and also 1948 was also the stricter introduction of Komendatura. That
Yes.
was 1945. 45 was already introduction of Komendatura, which was much stricter than before. So I don't know if
Yeah, the 8th of January 1945, there's two documents by the Council, the SNK, the Council of People's Commissariat. So one is the restrictions of special settlers under a special settlement regime. The other is the powers and obligations of the special commandant, the Spetskommandantur.
But the Spetskommandantur was already there from the beginning, from 1941, when the special settlements were created.
Right. Yeah, the 28th. Yes, the 28th of. Well, even before. I mean, they talk about them when the kulaks are deported in 1930. But yes, the system is recreated by a decree the same day that the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet publicly orders the deportation of the Volga Germans. There's a decree signed by Beria on 28th of August 1941, creating the section of special settlement under uh, the NKVD. So the OSP, as it's called, becomes its own separate, I guess, subsection under the NKVD, separated from Gulag at that point.
So, just specifically about Kommandantura. So the Kommandantura was created in 1940. Well, it was there when they were in special settlements, 1941, after the deportation, and I know that part of the what all Russian Germans talk about. That part of the Kommandantura thing was that they had to go and register themselves each month. So they had to go by the Lichner dealer, so they had to write files.
And if there were changes in the family composition, they had to register again. So if anytime somebody died or got married or was born or fled,
3 days of
yes,
happening,
correct.
And otherwise you would be punished.
Correct.
And but a lot of Russian Germans were, but the thing is, it was queues. You had to go, and you had to wait in the queue, and with your Lichner, with your personal file that you brought yourself, then you had to wait in the queue with all these other Russian Germans. Then you got in, and then there is this commissariat, whatever person who would stamp it and check data, and then you had to do it over and over and over again. But then, so my understanding is 45 was the in 45, I think it was just the Kommandantura was just from my reading, got even more stricter. And I think
right. Well, they streamlined it. So there were all of these like ad hoc decrees before 45. And in 45, they had like there's two, like one's 1 page and the other is 2 pages documents which set out explicitly the restrictions for all of the special settlers and the powers and responsibilities for all of the special commandants. So it's now down to 3 pages, basically governing the entire life of. At that point, they were up to like something like 2.5 million special settlers, of which over 1 million were ethnic Germans. Well, I think less than, because many were still in the labor army. But you're still talking, many hundreds of thousands of people that came under this, and it grew. Certainly by 1948, there's over 1 million German special settlers, and it gets up to, I think, a 1.2 million in 53.
And those the condition of the Kommandantura, because they introduced after 1945, they introduced more of the agents.
Yes, informants. Yeah.
More informants, and I read somewhere that just in Kazakhstan, I think there were 28,000 agents to spy on the special settlers. And so some of those agents, there were 3 types. There's someone who came externally, but there are also some that were planted as Russian, as kind of Germans who lived among others. And for me, when I read it, it was fascinating, because when I was growing up, there was always this fear among all Russian Germans to kind of not to speak too loud, and this constant thing of the wolves have ears, and don't talk too loud, and don't speak German too loud, all of those things. And I think this is one of the things that came from that time, because you really didn't know if your neighbor was a agent or not.
This is
Um,
true. I actually have a really interesting story about that. I interviewed it in the town is Sadovaya, which is a little tiny settlement west of Bishkek. I interviewed some Karachay women who had been deported as children in 1943 from their homeland to Kyrgyzstan. And they had not left since then. Since, I think one was 3 when she was deported, and the other was 7.
mm,
Uh, but I went there to interview them and some others, and I had some students with me. I didn't take any Kyrgyz students. I took Turkmen students, which was a
okay,
good choice on my part because when
because
I first got there, they were worried that it was the SNB, which is the Kyrgyz successor to the KGB, coming to finally arrest them for something they had done since the deportation.
yeah,
They still thought that the kind of Stalinist terror and surveillance system and special settlement restrictions were still being applied many years after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist.
yeah, but that's, I mean, to me, that's understandable. Because if you lived with that fear all your life and you passed it on to children and children passed on, you would, my grandparents were terrified of it, until even my grandmother, who moved to Germany, but after being in labor army and after being in Gulag, even after she moved to Germany, she was terrified of agents or someone, I don't know, picking her up and punishing her for something that she did. I think this is scars that are left in people's minds.
I suppose it's kind of somewhat understandable, but still, it seems it's hard as a Westerner for me to comprehend in 2008. I think this was 2009, right? Women being terrified, of any Kyrgyz person coming to their village, that they were going to be, essentially KGB. Uh,
Mm,
and as I said, I didn't take any Kyrgyz people. All of the people I took with me were Turkmen. So
okay.
that really diffused it, because obviously they were foreigners. They were not
Yeah.
connected to the government in Bishkek.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Well, that's good then. Yeah. I like what did Mr. Jones said. It's been used a few times. Destroy culture, erase God, and make a country full. Um, yeah. I think when I think about I think the Russian Germans, or the Germans that lived in Kazakhstan and Central Asia and Gulag and Siberia, after studying history and doing it for a while, I'm just amazed. I'm amazed how strong those people are, and I really don't know how they managed to survive, because those Germans who were deported to Kazakhstan or to Siberia, they were not allowed to speak their language. They were not allowed to practice their religion. They basically taking their freedom away, and yet they still managed to have families to pass on, especially women. Women, I'm sorry to say, but it was mostly women who ended up passing on the language, the culture, the food. So a lot of things were passed down with food. Um, and stories at that time, and those things, and
That's
songs.
that's true. There were a lot more men drafted into the labor army, and of course, a lot more died. But you also had, even when they survived,
Mm.
they didn't know necessarily where their old family was deported
Yeah,
after they had been mobilized in the labor army. So you had all these men that
yeah, that's
their German wives were still alive, in Kazakhstan or Siberia, and they were attached to work permanently in the Urals. And so they ended up taking a second wife, being, I guess, bigamist legally, but it was not prohibited. So you get these kind of like this whole wave of German men surviving the labor army that takes. I call them Stalin wives. They took Russian wives. The second wife, and so their old German families basically become abandoned in the special settlement regions of
Yeah.
Kazakhstan and Siberia, and they're over in the Urals where they had been mobilized for the Trudovaya Armia.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Well, they were not allowed to be in contact for 10 years as well after they were deported. So those 10 years, that means that the wives and the husbands really didn't know what happened to their family. So yeah, so you hope that they survived, but you really didn't know. A lot of them didn't. So yeah,
Right,
I mean,
and
mm,
as I said, they're taking Russian wives. So now the children from the second marriage, they tended to be much more assimilated into the Russian side than the German side.
mm, yeah. Oh my goodness, there were so many times when I was growing up, I really wanted my parents to take on Russian nationality. So I used to tell them, used to ask them why they wouldn't do it, or why wouldn't they get a Russian name? Why wouldn't they get a passport where it says Russian instead of German? Because having that bloody passport that I had or we had that said Lena Wolf, uh, Yelena Adamovna Wolf, German, and
Nemka.
it was Niemka, and it was just such a horrible thing to have. And I remember speaking to my mom saying, why don't you take on, like, why don't you change it to a Russian name and take Russian nationality? It would make it so much easier. I would have a normal passport. Nobody would look at you strange, and it was just makes assimilation easier. But my mother, I guess I guess she said, we are what we are. We're German, and that's what it is. And yeah.
When I registered my marriage, the Zaks, with my wife in Kyrgyzstan, they I left the line for nationalnost blank, and they asked me why. I said because in the U.S. we don't have that category.
And
and
I said, did you still have to fill it
they
in?
let me get away with it, leaving nationalnost blank.
Okay. No, well, it's because you're American, I
Yeah, it's
guess.
true.
Yeah. Yeah. If you were from the ex-Soviet Union, you wouldn't have gotten away with that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all of this having, yes, having nationalis in your passport was a very, for Germans, was a bad thing. Because I guess that also meant that you could not travel too far. You couldn't until 1970s, and later you could not leave Kazakhstan. You could not leave the place where you were assigned to. And then it was, I think, 1970s. The restrictions were
It was never 72, 3rd of November,
the,
1972. They
yeah.
allowed you to apply to over for propuska, but it wasn't necessarily guaranteed. But before then, there was just a blanket ban on Germans. Although there were some that did manage to return, not a whole lot, but a few like snuck into the Volga region
But the problem
earlier.
people even didn't know about that. It was not openly discussed. So even when the restriction was lifted, many people didn't know about it.
Yeah, but the activists did because they had a concerted movement to try and move to Estonia and Latvia because they thought it'd be easier to move to Germany from there. And of course, the
That's where
Baltic German influence was very heavy in places like Tallinn and Riga, and especially Tartu. So you had I think it was almost 9,000 Central Asian Germans moved to Estonia in the 70s.
Yeah. I was born in Latvia as well, in Jelgava, and the idea was to move to Germany from there as well.
Right, because I don't know if it was true, but the perception was that it was easier to get permission to emigrate out of uh, the Baltic states than it was out of Central Asia.
Yeah, it was at that time when my parents. Well, the purpose was to move to Latvia. Was to That's where most of my relatives left from Latvia to went to Germany in the 70s. And but my we didn't manage at the end, and we ended up going back to Kazakhstan. But yeah, most of my uncles and great aunts and so on, they left from Latvia to Germany. There was a window of opportunity where it was possible, but I think by the time we were there, it was not possible anymore. So
It would have been, there was a more liberalized uh, period in the 70s, and then they cracked down in the 80s again.
yeah. Someone put Ani, and that's so true. Ani were there everywhere. Ani always watching and listening, Brian, and that's true because honestly, you speak to Russian German, and they say if you ask them, so who was listening, or who did this, who did the restriction, who was listening to you, or who was oppressing you? Ani, Ani делали. You just go, who is Ani? Ani. So, and you know what Ani is, but it's never said in words. So you know it's the state. You know that it's in Kavadé or and so on. But I found it always fascinating that even saying the word, like naming it for what it was, people could not do that. You didn't say, "Oh, NKVD was listening" or KGB was listening. People would just say, "Ani." So my parents, up until now, they say, они нам сказали, они нас депортировали, они делали мой раз.
Well,
And
because it's I understand why the pronoun is used. It's not as difficult to use the pronoun than it is to specifically name. That's a more difficult step.
well, I think it was for a very long time they were not allowed to say that aloud anyway. You could not say, oh, NKVD, KGB нас выслала. You could not say that. You would have been imprisoned for it. But you could say "они," right? So I think it's just a learned behavior, survival as well. It just has something to do with.
Yeah, it's also kind of universal. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's a very famous book about the first communist government in Poland. It's called Ani because the Polish word is the same as the Russian.
Mhm.
And it was written by a famous woman Polish journalist, right? But I mean, in Poland, they just refer to the new communist government as Ani as well.
Mm.
So it seems to kind
Well,
of be universal. The way the communists operated is they were just Ani.
sure, but I do think that it comes from the in a way from the fear not able to say who goes "они"
Right,
is.
initially, yes, yes,
Yeah.
I'm sure it was
In
because
Poland.
the special commandants had the power to throw people in jail for 5 days and uh, issue fines up to 100 rubles, and that's just what they officially had. Because I was told by some women who were local Germans in Kyrgyzstan. I mean, they weren't ever deported, but they were made special settlers after the end of the war in
Mhm.
1945.
Oh wow.
And they said when they went to the market, so basically just to go to the Renok,
Mhm.
which without getting the kind of internal passport, a visa by the commandant, we're talking basically like less than 5 kilometers away. They were caught and arrested, and she said she spent 8 days in jail, and there was no trials. It was just the commandant just threw her in the local jail.
Yeah.
So even though it says 5 days in the document, right, oral testimony, I have at least one that said 8 days.
Yeah, so that was part of those Verschärfung, like the making Kommandatura more strict. That was, I think, 1945 or 48. We're really leaving further than 5 kilometers from your special settlements pretty much meant you could be gone into prison for up to 5 years. And leaving the settlement or escaping the settlement, we got 20 years of Gulag. I think that was 1945.
The 20 years was written in 48. The 48 Novation document
okay, 48.
is if you escape from the special settlements, it's 20 years of they use the word kartorika, back to Tsarist era type terms for hard labor. But and then anybody who was a free citizen that helped them escape, especially to return to their previous areas of settlement before the deportation, they could get 5 years in prison as well.
Right.
But those cases had to go through. They have like a troika of the MVD by that time, so it was a kind of a kangaroo trial, like the initial dekulakization in 1930. It wasn't just one guy. It was I guess they call it a special council of the NVD. So you had this kind of fake due process in it.
Yeah. Well, that's what my grandma after Trudarmia, she 1945, she left to go to thinking the war ended, they're finally free, they can leave, and she decided she would go back to her village in southern Russia, Gnadenfeld, and walked, and it was quite a long distance. I think 1,500 kilometers. I ended up counting it, checking it out. Terrible way home because she didn't have passport, so she didn't get passport, of course, because she escaped. And without, as you know, probably in the Soviet Union at that time, if you didn't have passport, you could be checked anytime. If you didn't have passport, you would be arrested.
Right.
And they had to kind of hide, walk most of the time, and then sometimes on the trains, but not trains to destination. So it was a very long journey. But and the fact they got there, realized that Gnadenfeld wasn't German anymore, that there were other people living in their houses. Stalin resettled other people in there, so they could not get their houses back, they could not go back to their place. And on top of that, she then got caught and got 20 years of Gulag, and her child, my father, they sent him to an orphanage. So that's what happened to her, yeah. So she was, sentenced 48, 20 years of Gulag.
As harrowing as that sounded, actually, statistically, that happened to quite a few ethnic Germans. I think the number of escapees from special settlements that were caught and then sentenced was in the thousands. I think somewhere around almost 20,000 were caught and detained. Well, I have to look up how many were sent to gulag sentences, but far more than you would think. So there was a fairly large number of people that happened to, believe it or not.
Yeah, there were a lot of, I mean, she talks about a lot of Germans, definitely. She was in USSR and Vorkuta. So there were a lot of German women. It was a woman camp. So there were a lot of German women, but also anyone. I think it's the most international thing. They were definitely Jewish. There was a Jewish woman who was a friend of hers, and who spoke very good German, and they spoke
Yeah,
Yiddish.
we went you over the. I'm convinced at this point that they were probably from Latvia.
Yeah, I actually, after speaking to you, and I do remember her saying that she was from a neighboring village. So I think it was actually from there were Jewish villages close to Gnadenfeld, and
Okay.
so she was, because I remember her saying that she lost her son was sent to orphanage just like my father as well, and they were looking for their sons together, and she knew her from the childhood.
All
Um,
right. Okay. Well, that's different. But I mean, what makes it kind of why I would say that is because you said that they were fluent speakers of German.
yeah, she was. Yeah.
So if they're speaking German rather than Yiddish, one place where you would had a number of Jews that spoke German was in Latvia.
Mm, yeah. And that's probably the case as well. I assume, as you mentioned, there are probably more educated Jewish, more well off. But also, from my reading, I understood that there were a lot, like where she lived, the Jewish population, Jewish villages next to them. I guess they were cooperating and living next door to each other. So it was just inevitable that they learned each other's languages as well. Um, but I just want to say yes. So in Gulag, it was very cross-cultural, and my grandma used to tell me "hi" and "how are you" in different languages. So she used to tell me like they were Finnish, Polish, and
Yeah, a lot of Poles ended up in Vorkuta. The one of the leaders of the uprising of Vorkuta was Edward Buka, who was Polish,
oh,
and he wrote his memoirs about the uprising after. So he was not. I don't know if he wrote his memoirs, but Edward Buka, I know, was Polish, was involved in the uprising of Vorkuta. And there were also a lot of Western Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Latvians and Estonians in Vorkuta
yeah,
after the war.
yeah. Yeah, well, she was there after the war because she was in prison 48, and she was released after Stalin's death. So yeah,
Let's see if I can find.
uh, gulags were
Okay, so yeah, Buka did write his memoirs. He lived all the way up to 2013, but he
okay.
was a member of the Polish underground fighting against the Germans, who was arrested and sent to the Gulag by the Soviets and was at Vorkuta.
So that's fun. So he was fighting against the Germans, and yet he was captured by the Soviets and sent to Vorkuta.
Correct.
That's amazing. Why wouldn't you do that to a person who was helping?
Because he wasn't a communist. He was with the Polish Home Army, which was not controlled by the Soviets.
Hmm, yeah, I guess they were just sending anyone who didn't fit. Um,
So he.
um, we have been talking for almost 2 hours.
Yeah, I was gonna say wrap it up, but thank you very much again for coming on and discussing it. The history of Germans from in Russia and the Soviet Union, particularly the 1940s and 50s here. And so, if you have any final thing to say, you can wrap it up, I guess, and I'll let you go. But I do appreciate you taking the time and effort to come on to my show for a second time. The first time didn't scare you off.
No, I do think it's fascinating, and I really, well, I see this coming and talking to you as a kind of learning opportunity as well, because I am still learning, and So, I mean, I have quite so if you would see, I have quite a lot of papers written by you and marked and so on. So I'm studying, um, and I guess for me, because I'm working on my graphic novel, so
Yeah.
it's
Wow.
yeah.
Yes, you've got all of the pieces there. Well, but yeah, I greatly appreciate your perspective and your knowledge here. And so you've been one of the more popular guests I've had on
Hey.
here.
By the way, I do have a recommendation for a graphic novel. I don't know if I will be able to find it quickly, but that was recommended to me by my illustrator, who's a German guy, Christoph, in Germany, and it has something to do with the history of um, kind of communist leaders getting together and going hunting, the last kind of hunt of communist leaders from different countries, including East Germany and Poland and Hungary, and going for a hunt. So it's quite interestingly done. I will be back. Just a second.
All right. All right, everybody that showed up in the chat, thank you very much. And again, no wait, she's gonna go show something. So I'll just hang out here for a second.
Here this. So,
Well, I can't see it.
can you see it?
No, you're away from the camera.
No, I'm not. I can see myself.
Well, I'm not seeing it on the. Oh, here it is. I see it now. It took a while. Yeah. Okay. So this is the. All right. So that's the picture by your illustrator. A book.
No, this is a comic. It's called The Hunting Party. It's done by French illustrators.
Okay.
It's brilliantly done. It's about it's about communist leaders from different countries, including Russia, Soviet Union, Hungary, Poland, getting together and going hunting in, I think, somewhere in Poland. And,
Okay.
it's brilliantly done, and it's about kind of the ideas of communism and how much you sacrifice and how much of your life you sacrifice for your ideas, for your beliefs in communism. And I highly recommend it if anyone is interested. It's very old. I think it was done in the 1980s, so it's quite old. But
Well, that's 40 years.
Yeah.
All right, I'll see if I can find it. Where was it published?
It's published by Titan Books.
And they're based where? What country?
I think originally, well, I think the artists are French, but this
France?
is
Okay.
London. Okay.
Oh, Britain. Okay.
So it's called The Hunting Party by. Okay, it's easier to show.
Somebody found one on eBay already.
I think it's brilliant if anyone gets access to it. Especially for people who are interested in communism and politicians. It's really.
All right. If people donate to my Patreon, I might be able to afford one.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll be talking to you in March for the Schmaltz's Zoom thing. And I'm very excited that Monica Gossman, who is played in the movie Iron Sky, which is the weirdest movie I've ever seen, I think.
Okay.
Will be one of the people. So she's also from Kazakhstan.
Yeah, I mean they were praising her quite a lot. She looks amazing. So yeah, we'll be interested to meet her.
Yes.
Yeah, that's quite cool to have famous people on there. But I'm glad that you're going to be there as well because Eric Schmaltz mentioned you last.
Yeah, I've known Schmaltz for a long time, but I actually did not meet him in person until I brought him to Africa.
Oh, you brought him to Africa.
I did for a conference.
Wow. On Russian Germans in Africa?
Our topic was ethnic Germans in Asia. The conference was the study of Asia by African scholars, because the study of Asia in Africa,
Okay.
and it was at the University of Ghana, but the big sponsor for the money was out of the Netherlands.
Okay, I see. I see. Well, also really happy to hear about you finding verlag or publisher for your.
Yes, well, it's not finalized, but yeah, the first step has been cleared. The first hurdle.
As we say in German, fingers crossed that it all goes really good.
All right, thank you very much. Vielen Dank.
Okay, good. Bis zum nächsten Mal. Until next time.
All right, спасибо большое. До свидания.
До свидания. До свидания.
Спокойной ночи.
Спокойной
Right.
ночи. Yeah, нам. Спокойной ночи. Yeah, Chile has quite a few German population. That's interesting. Yeah.
All right. All right. So you should I end it now?
Yeah.
All right. I'll just